Hey there, guys. So there's been a lot of debate recently about this op return limit relay policy change with Bitcoin Core, and there's been a lot of people that are pro op return limit removal. There's a lot of people that are very anti op return limit removal. There are lots of people that have rallied the cry to switch their node implementation for Bitcoin from Bitcoin Core to NOT. And this is a pretty technical topic, and I think that a lot of the people speaking on this topic are not very well informed in terms of how these things actually work. So what I thought I would do is explain what exactly the op return change means technically, and what the implications of that are, and why it's actually a good change, and why it's not really something to get bent out of shape about, and definitely not something that you would want to go totally scorched earth over. So I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can, and hopefully it will be clear and easy for you to see once I go through the basics of it. I'm assuming that you know what the mempool is. I think most Bitcoiners know what the mempool is, but if you don't, the mempool is basically just this pool of transactions that have been broadcast to the network, but they're not included in any Bitcoin blocks yet. So they're not confirmed. They're not in the blockchain. They're just kind of floating around in the ether between the various nodes on the network. And the nodes are talking to each other and sharing this mempool of transactions that want to get included in the next Bitcoin block, are willing to pay to get included in the next Bitcoin block, but haven't been included yet. So for simplicity's sake, let's just imagine that we have just a couple of people in our network. Let's say that we have Alice here, that's A, and we have Brad, which is B, and we have Charlie, which is C. And Alice is peers with Brad or Bob, and I'm going to say Bob because it's easier. Bob is peers with Charlie. For the sake of simplicity here, let's just assume that Charlie is the miner in this relationship, right? Obviously, in a real network, we'd have way more peers, and we'd have lots of miners, and they'd be spread out all over the world. But just for the sake of simplicity, right? Let's just imagine that in this hypothetical Bitcoin network, we only have 3 peers. And Adam is peers with Bob, and Bob is peers with Charlie. Adam says to himself that he really, really wants to include all of the family pictures from his recent trip to the Poconos in the Bitcoin blockchain, because he really likes those pictures and he doesn't ever want to lose them, and he's willing to pay like $100,000 to have all of those pictures encoded into an op return on a Bitcoin transaction. The Bitcoin network says that this is perfectly valid, that this is a valid Bitcoin transaction, and all of the nodes, Adam's node and Bob's node and Charlie's node, they would all agree that this is a valid Bitcoin transaction. So Adam creates this transaction that has all of these pictures from his family trip to the Poconos encoded in this transaction. And he sends it to Bob, and he says, "Hey Bob, I've got this Bitcoin transaction with all of my family pictures in it, and I'm willing to pay $100,000 to get this into the Bitcoin blockchain." And Bob's node says, "Oh, hey, yeah, I see that transaction that you got there, and it is valid. That is a valid Bitcoin transaction, but I'm not going to send it to Charlie because I don't relay any transactions that have a op return payload greater than 80 bytes. And this is like a ton of data, and you're paying a ton of money to try to get this included in the blockchain. I'm not sending this to Charlie. Sorry, man. I'm just not going to do it. I don't want that in the blockchain." Bob is pro filters, right? So Bob, in this example, is our filterer. And he's filtering that transaction from Adam out of the relay, or out of the mempool. He's not sending it forward onto Charlie, who in this example is our miner. He's just getting rid of it, right? He's saying, "Sorry, buddy, I don't want that in the blockchain." Adam's like, "Well, crap, man. I really wanted to get my family pictures from the Poconos in the Bitcoin blockchain so that it's there forever. What am I going to do?" So he calls up Charlie, because he saw Charlie on a forum or something, or he met him on Twitter, and he knows Charlie is a miner, whatever. So he calls up Charlie, and he says, "Hey, Charlie, look, I got this Bitcoin transaction, and it's got a ton of data in it because it's got all my family photos in it. and I'm willing to pay like just a ton of money for this Bitcoin transaction. Will you please see what you can do? I know that you're a miner. And Charlie says, you know what? I was looking at this transaction that you got here, and there's a lot of money to be made to include this transaction in the Bitcoin blockchain. And to be honest, I don't really care if you put the pictures of your family in the blockchain as long as you pay for it. So I'll tell you what, you go back and edit that transaction and bump up the fees by 10% so that I get a little extra money. Don't worry about sending it to Brad. Just send it straight to me. I mean, from now on, you and I have like this special little relationship where I've opened up this telephone line to you, and you can just send that transaction straight to me, and I'll include it in the blockchain. And this is exactly what happens right now with these transactions that contain like a ton of arbitrary data that are valid at the consensus level, which means that Adam's node, Bob's node, and Charlie's node all say that this transaction with all of these pictures from the Poconos is a valid Bitcoin transaction. It gets included in the Bitcoin blockchain, and everybody's node says that it's a valid transaction, and they don't reject it from the network. But Bob thinks that he's saving the world by running this filter and refusing to pass Adam's transaction on to Charlie. And you might think to yourself, well, this is good, right? Like, we want this. Bob is a hero. Bob is standing up for something. Bob has the right ethos. He understands that Bitcoin is money and that we don't want a bunch of random pictures in the Bitcoin blockchain from Adam's family trip to the Poconos. Right, and I would actually agree with that. I'm not pro-spam by any means, as many people would accuse me of for saying that I think that removing the op return limit is good. But let me explain to you why it actually is good. Because first of all, Bob is not doing anything because Adam is just sending this transaction directly to Charlie, and it's getting put into the blockchain anyway. But what's happening here is that Charlie is actually capturing a premium from Adam. And in doing that, he's capturing huge revenues from all of this data that's getting stuffed into the blockchain, but he's also charging Adam like a surplus premium of what Adam would normally be paying if he could just relay that to anybody on the network. But let's say that we have a new person come into our network. Let's call him Mike. And Mike decides that he wants to get into the mining game too. So he does what he thinks he should do, and he peers up with Charlie, and he peers up with Brad, and he peers up with Adam. And he's mining blocks, and he's doing pretty well, and he discovers a block, and he makes some money. But he's not making nearly as much money as Charlie, right? Like, Charlie is capturing this huge premium because he has this established relationship with Adam. You know, at scale, what this maybe looks like is Charlie has a lot of capital. He's very well capitalized. Let's say he's a publicly traded miner, and he has a team of engineers, and his team of engineers have built out this API, and Adam can just send a request for this custom transaction that none of the nodes on the network want to relay back and forth to each other in the mempool. Charlie has this API set up so people like Adam can just send their high dollar transactions to him, and he charges them a premium on top of that, right? Because you have all of this arbitrary data that's inside of this transaction, and every byte of that data costs money, right? So Charlie is not just cashing in on a huge transaction that contains tons of data that Adam has to pay for, but in many cases he's also charging Adam a premium, and he's making a lot of revenue from doing this. And Mike has to compete with this, but Mike isn't capitalized enough, doesn't have the engineering knowledge enough, or just the manpower to establish this special API relationship with Adam. So he's missing out on all of this revenue. So what the op return limit removal suggests that we should do, it says, hey, Brad, listen, we know that you are really into these filters. You think that you are upholding the ethos of the Bitcoin network, but listen, like, you're not actually doing anything. And in fact, you're actually hurting Mike, because right now Mike is losing out on a lot of revenue, and it's making him less competitive, and Mike is actually getting ready to go out of business because he can't compete with Charlie. Charlie's making so much more money than Mike. Charlie's able to continuously expand his warehouse and hire new engineers and buy more ASIC miners. Mike just has like a couple of bit axes in his garage or something like that. Like, he's just trying to make it. He just can't compete with Charlie. Like, Charlie is pushing him out on the margin at every level because he's just making tons of cash, and we don't know how he's doing it. So what we think we should do is we should remove this limit on the op return. So basically at the consensus level, and when I say consensus level, what I mean is like what your node will say is or is not a valid Bitcoin transaction. Not what it's willing to relay in the mempool, but what it actually believes is a valid Bitcoin transaction. Op returns functionally have no limit in the amount of data that you can put into them. Like virtually speaking, there's no limit. So there's no like law in the Bitcoin code that says if a transaction contains 150 bytes of data or 1,000 bytes of data or whatever, like pick a number, where it's not valid, right? There's just this rule, this arbitrary rule that says we're not going to pass along mempool transactions that want to get into the blockchain if their op return payload is greater than 80 bytes. The proposal to remove the op return limit is just simply trying to put Mike and Charlie on a level playing field and not give Charlie this extreme unfair advantage to capture this extra revenue that Adam is willing to pay. And you might say to yourself that, you don't want Adam's family pictures in the blockchain, right? And like I said earlier, I would actually agree with you. And I would actually agree with Brad here, or Bob. I think I've gone back and forth between Brad and Bob this whole time. I would actually agree with Bob, but I think Bob is misguided because Bob wants to abandon the node implementation and go off and run, his own kooky fork that's run by one guy that promises him the world and promises him the ability to like filter out all of these pictures from the Poconos that he doesn't want in his blockchain, his precious Bitcoin blockchain. But the truth is that this is just a lie, right? Like this doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't do anything. And it's a really weird hill to die on. It's a really weird place to go scorched earth and draw lines in the sand and abandon really well-established like best practices when it comes to developing secure software. Bitcoin is nothing outside of the secure software that you run to actually use it. I know there's a lot of people out there that like use Bitcoin, interact with Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin, hold Bitcoin, sell Bitcoin, whatever, use it as money, whatever, that maybe don't even touch Bitcoin Core at all. But you would really be underselling the value of Bitcoin if you don't understand the value of Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core is the most secure, heavily reviewed, heavily scrutinized piece of software in the world. I have no doubt about that. And you don't want to just abandon that. You don't want to just burn the house down and go to the nearest guy on the street and be like, hey, guy on the street, you're in charge now because you're giving us the stuff that we think that we want, that we think is going to make a difference. The truth of the matter is that data is arbitrary. You can encode data in any way you want. And what I mean is that like just simply having an op return, a place in a transaction where you can just insert arbitrary data is kind of irrelevant. Whether or not there's limits on that data, it doesn't really matter because if you know anything about software, you can take data and encode it into literally anything. You can take data and encode it into the waves and the valleys of amplitude modulation in a radio wave, right? And just saying that like somebody can't encode data into this op return structure and put it in a Bitcoin transaction is not really going to stop anything, because then the people that really want the photos of their Poconos trip encoded into a transaction, they just switch to some other encoding scheme. And I mean, this could get to the point where it's like extremely obtuse and arbitrary. But where we ultimately end up is like in this game of cat and mouse, right? And, I'm not necessarily saying that you should never play the game of cat and mouse. I think that maybe there could be a conversation to be had that there is some value. Some engineering resources should be devoted to playing whack-a-mole with the spammers to constantly try to cut off whatever their current method of encoding data into a transaction is. If Brad is really serious about making sure that Adam and Charlie can't put these pictures of the Poconos into the blockchain anymore, then what he has to do is he needs Knots to make a consensus change. And what that actually means is he would need his node to say that any transaction that contains, for example, a bunch of pictures of the Poconos, but it could be any data, like any data that Brad or Bob doesn't like that he considers spam. Like let's just say any transaction with any op return data, he considers that a non-valid Bitcoin transaction and he rejects it. That would really be the only way for Bob to actually functionally exclude this data that he doesn't like, that he considers spam, from the blockchain. And that's going to almost surely cause a consensus split. And what you get when you have a consensus split is you have Bob's version of the blockchain with all of this history of transactions on it, and you have Adam and Charlie's version of the blockchain with all of these transactions on it. And these transactions are different. This one here is different than this one here. And this is what we call a chain split. This is when we get two different Bitcoins with two different histories. And we don't want this. We don't want to screw around with this. It's really not worth it to just try and keep Adam from putting pictures in the blockchain. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. It goes back to what I explained earlier, in that Bitcoin transactions are just data, and data can be encoded in pretty much an infinite number of ways. So if you go back to my earlier example of encoding data into the peaks and valleys of amplitude modulation in radio waves, that's really just binary, right? It's either high or it's low. So that's just a 1 or a 0. Okay, let's say in this hypothetical future scenario, we end up in a world where everybody's switched to knots and Adam and Charlie are defeated and they can no longer put data into op-return. So Adam comes up with this new way to encode data in Bitcoin, where he sends transaction 1, transaction 2, transaction 3, transaction 4, transaction 5, transaction 6. And he's, in each of these transactions, he's just sending money to himself, but he's just encoding data in binary in the amount field for each transaction. And I mean, guys, I know that this sounds stupid, right? But this is literally all Bitcoin is. It's just data. And you could encode literally anything in any way you could imagine into the Bitcoin blockchain. And so what I could do here is I could write a program that just takes all of these transaction IDs, and I could decode all of this binary on the other side, and it would print out a message or a picture or whatever it was that I wanted to decode from this data. And trust me, if people started coming up with really stupid ways of encoding data into Bitcoin like this, where you were like using the amount field of a transaction to encode like eight bytes or whatever this is per transaction, like that becomes extremely inefficient. You think op-return spam is bad? Like this would be 10 times worse. And you literally cannot stop this. If someone wants to pay to put a bunch of ones and zeros in a Bitcoin transaction, those ones and zeros can encode and decode literally anything you can think of. You cannot stop them. This is the price that you pay to have a Sybil-resistant distributed source of truth. This is the price that you pay to have a censorship-resistant, globally accessible hard money. It's just the way it is, because a Bitcoin transaction is just simply data, and you can encode anything you want into data and figure out a way to get it into a transaction. So in that sense, like op-return is really not that big of a deal, because people are going to figure out other much stupider ways of encoding data into a Bitcoin transaction than op-return. Bitcoin was designed from the very beginning to have proof of work, and proof of work is Bitcoin's anti-spam mechanism. So the fact that Bitcoin has blocks every 10 minutes, which is deterministically generated every 10 minutes, right? So like roughly every 10 minutes, we get a Bitcoin block, and that's determined by this difficulty algorithm that recalculates every 2 weeks based on how frequently blocks are being discovered, which is downstream of just how many miners are online, how much hash power is on the network trying to mine the next block. Proof of work actually comes to us from Hashcash. Hashcash was developed by Adam Back, and it's an anti-spam protocol for email that basically forced your computer to do a little bit of work, a little bit of computationally expensive work before it could send a message, to basically just filter out arbitrary spam. And that was what Bitcoin was designed from the very beginning to be, was a Sybil-resistant single source of truth with anti-spam measures. And that's what proof of work does for us. That's why we have limited throughput on transactions. Like we only have roughly one block every 10 minutes with only a certain amount of data inside of that block that's allowed to be included until it's completely full. And that's why you have to pay, and that when there's a lot of demand to put data into the next block, the fees go up. That is in and of itself an anti-spam measure. Hashcash was designed to do. It's why Satoshi chose to include proof of work in Bitcoin. It is an anti-spam measure, and it doesn't keep all spam out. It just makes spam prohibitively expensive as demand for the block space continues to increase. Right, and I think that there's a lot of nuanced discussion to be had there, but we're not having that nuanced discussion lately. What we're talking about is arbitrary nonsense that is actually not affecting anything. And I just think people should be really careful. They should be really careful about abandoning the best chance we have at a globally distributed, Sybil-resistant monetary ledger that enables us to have global self-clearing sound money, right? I think that we're at a precipice in the global economic landscape, and I think people shouldn't be screwing around and pretending like they know more than they actually do, and pretending like this is a hill to die on when it's absolutely not, pun intended. So yeah, I think that that's all I had. So let me know what you guys think.